The tension in the conference room was so thick, you could feel it in your throat. It was day 2 of the International Sovereignty and Resource Security Summit in Brussels, a gathering that had already seen its fair share of awkward silences and passive-aggressive speeches, but nothing compared to what was about to unfold. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, sat at the far end of the long-polished oak table. His presence was deliberate, quiet, almost understated. No entourage, no fanfare, just him, a leather folder, and an unwavering gaze that had unsettled more than a few delegates since the summit began. At the other end sat JD Vance, junior U.S. Senator from Ohio, recently elevated to a leading voice. In American foreign policy circles, Vance had come to the summit with a clear mission: defend American interests and keep rising African nationalism in check, especially the kind symbolized by leaders like Traoré. The room was filled with diplomats, heads of state, economists, and military strategists. Flags lined the walls. Translations buzzed softly through headsets. Cameras blinked quietly, live streaming the session to millions around the world. The topic for this panel: natural resource independence in the global south, subtext control. "I believe," said Vance, shifting his gaze toward Traoré, "that we should be honest about who belongs in these rooms." His voice had the confidence of a man who'd said things like this before and gotten applause for it. "Some of us come here representing real institutions. Others represent noise, emotion, chaos masquerading as revolution." He didn't say Traoré's name. He didn't have to. A few uneasy chuckles echoed through the hall. A delegate from France pretended to sip water. Someone from Canada tapped nervously on their tablet. Even Traoré's interpreter paused, unsure whether to translate Vance's veiled insult word for word. Traoré didn't move. His face unreadable. His eyes locked on Vance like a soldier, reading the wind before firing a shot. "Let me be more direct," Vance said, this time turning fully toward Traoré. "There are those who rise through democracy, through systems, through merit. And then there are men who seize power by force and think that makes them equals. But sitting in this room doesn't make you one of us. You don't belong here." The words landed like a slap. Cameras zoomed in. Social media feeds exploded. #Traoré trended within seconds. The silence that followed was not diplomatic. It was surgical, as if the entire room were holding its breath, waiting to see whether Traoré would flinch, fold, or explode. Out. Instead, Traoré calmly opened his leather folder, removed a single sheet of paper, placed it in front of him, and looked directly at Vance. "Are you finished?" he asked quietly. The words were soft, but the tone, it was the sound of flint striking steel. The room hadn't moved in 30 seconds. Not a single cough, not a shuffle, not even a breath that dared interrupt what had just been said. A young African president had just been told in front of world leaders, journalists, and live streams that he didn't belong in the room. And yet, he hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't slammed a fist. He had simply asked, "Are you finished?" JD Vance smirked, but it was the kind of smirk that covered nerves. The kind politicians wear when they expect to win and suddenly realize they might. Not. Traoré stood up slowly. He didn't need to clear his throat. The microphone didn't squeal. There was no rustle of paper. Just the deliberate silence of a man who knew that his words would be remembered long after the summit ended. He placed his hands on the table and spoke not with anger, but with precision. "Senator Vance," he began, "you speak of systems, merit, and institutions. So let me ask you, which institution gave your country the right to invade others for oil? Which system decided that the minerals under African soil belong to European contracts? Which merit put your companies in charge of our gold, our cobalt, our future?" A wave of shifting bodies. Some looked down. Others stared at him with the intensity of history being rewritten before their eyes. "You say I seized power," Traoré continued, voice rising just slightly as though power in Africa is handed over like a baton in a fair race. "Oh, my country was being looted from within and from without. My people were dying, and the world sent consultants, not compassion. I didn't seize power. I stepped into a vacuum left by decades of betrayal." He took a step forward. You say I don't belong in this room, but let me tell you something, Senator. I'm still standing. After decades of exploitation, colonization, military coups backed by foreign hands, and conditional aid disguised as generosity, I'm still standing. Traoré paused and looked out across the table. Some of you came here with bulletproof limousines and diplomatic armor, came here with scars. My country is poor in dollars, yes, but rich in memory. And in case you forgot, memory is stronger than money. There was a silence that didn't feel like fear. It felt like reverence. Traoré tapped the paper in front of him. This is the mineral rights contract that your administration pressured us to sign 2 months ago, he said, looking at Vance. We declined. No. And now I understand why that bothered you. Vance tried to speak, but the moderator suddenly raised a hand. Let the president finish. And he wasn't done. Not even close. Traoré's fingers rested gently on the contract, but his words now hit like controlled detonations. You talk about institutions, Senator Vance, about systems. Well, whose systems are they? Who built them? And more importantly, who were they built to serve? He glanced around the table, scanning the faces of European ministers, American strategists, African presidents trying to blend into their seats. These systems were never neutral. They were never global. They were designed in cities like Washington and Paris to keep certain voices loud and others silent. A low hum of murmurs began to rise in the room. Journalists whispered to each other, hands flying across keyboards. The translator for a German diplomat stopped mid-sentence to make sure she'd heard correctly. She had. You ask, what qualifies me to sit at this table? Traoré continued. Let me answer with a question. What qualified your countries to redraw African borders with rulers and maps drawn in smoke-filled rooms? What qualified foreign corporations to drill into our soil and sell what they found to the highest bidder without ever asking the people? Who lived above it? He took a breath, not out of fatigue, but to let the silence absorb the truth. I am not a perfect man, he said. But I was chosen by my people in the streets, not by lobbyists in a boardroom. I answer to mothers who bury their sons after terror attacks, not to shareholders demanding dividends. The room was no longer just listening, it was leaning in. You say I didn't come through your institutions. You're right, because your institutions were built to keep people like me out, to train African leaders to think like Europeans, to speak like Americans, to beg like children. He turned to Vance again. I do not beg, not for contracts, not for recognition, not even for respect. Respect is earned. And if surviving centuries of plunder and still walking into this room with my head held high doesn't earn it, then your respect is too cheap to matter. Few claps broke the silence, hesitant, uncertain, but they grew. First from the South African delegate, then Mali, then Brazil. Within seconds, the room erupted into something rare in diplomatic halls. Honest? Applause. But Traoré wasn't finished. I stand here not just as a president. I stand as the embodiment of every nation that was told to wait its turn to grow through debt, to develop through dependence. And I am telling you, our turn is now, and we will not grow inside your system. We will outgrow it. Vance didn't smile. This time he didn't speak. He simply looked down at the table and for the first time that day said nothing at all. As the applause finally softened into silence, Traoré remained standing, not in defiance, but in deliberate control of the moment. He didn't bask in it. He redirected it. This summit, he said, turning slightly toward the moderator, was called to discuss the future of global cooperation. But so far, we've only talked about who gets to sit at which table and who gets to speak. That's not a conversation about the future. It's a performance of the past. The words landed like measured blows. His tone was calm, but each sentence chipped away at centuries of unspoken hierarchy. The real question, he continued, isn't whether I belong in this room. It's whether this room is ready for the future. Because let me be clear, the future is not a round table where the powerful carve up the powerless. The future is not the IMF deciding how many teachers we can afford. It is not foreign military stationed outside our gold mines. A delegate from Ghana nodded subtly. A camera zoomed in. Journalists smelled the story of the year unfolding live. The future, Traoré said, placing his hand firmly on the wood grain of the table, is communities that grow their own food. Countries that refine their own minerals. Young Africans who don't have to cross oceans to find dignity. And let me say this clearly, the future does not ask for permission. He turned back to Vance, whose earlier bravado had now faded to something quieter. Not fear, but recognition. You said, I don't belong in this room. But Senator, this room belongs to people who are willing to face uncomfortable truths. Belongs to leaders who understand that strength is not measured in military aid or GDP, but in how many children sleep safely at night. It belongs to those who've carried their countries on their backs, not just profited from their pain. Room felt different now, as if its center of gravity had shifted a few degrees towards something new. A new tone, a new rhythm. The momentum had turned. Traoré reached into his folder again and held up a photo. A color print of a young boy standing barefoot in a rice field in northern Burkina Faso. This child, he said, is the reason I govern. Not for legacy, not for applause, not for a seat in a summit. He is why I wake up every morning and choose to fight corruption, resist foreign domination, and challenge global norms that serve only the powerful. The image struck a chord just because of the boy's simplicity, but because of what it symbolized, a leader placing real lives over real politic. You want to know what qualifies me, Senator Vance? Traoré asked, lowering the photo. I didn't come here to be included in your game. I came here to change the rules. And suddenly, the room that had questioned his place began to wonder if he was, in fact, the only one truly qualified to lead it. By now, the tension that had once filled the conference room had melted into something else. Revelation. Traoré didn't need volume. He didn't need theatrics. He used silence like punctuation and truth like a scalpel. JD Vance sat back, arms crossed tightly. He looked like a man recalculating his next move in a game he thought he was winning. A long time, the United States had set the rhythm of the room. But Traoré had shifted the beat, and now everyone was dancing to his cadence. You speak of power, Senator Traoré continued, voice steady, almost gentle now. But power is changing form. Once it came from armies, then from corporations, then from media. Now it comes from clarity, from knowing who you are, what you stand for, and who you're willing to lose if it means keeping your soul. He scanned the room again, slower this time, not for approval, for accountability. For decades, Africa has been invited into rooms like this only to be lectured, scolded for being corrupt, warned against working with China, coached on debt ceilings and democratic maturity. But tell me, who lectures the World Bank when it funds? Projects that fail? Who scolds NATO when their bombs miss? Who warns the U.S. when it backs dictators for the sake of stability? The rhetorical questions hit like sledgehammers, not because they hadn't been asked before, but because this time they weren't asked from a protest sign. They were asked from the front of the room. Let me put it plainly, Traoré said. You don't get to call it global cooperation if you're the only one writing the rules. And you certainly don't get to define legitimacy when your history is built on colonial violence, resource theft, and strategic silence. A few aides near the back exchanged tense glances. Someone typed something into a phone too fast, a live translator. In Arabic briefly stopped, not because she couldn't keep up, because she just heard something that didn't need translation. Traoré leaned forward slightly. I don't need to belong in your room, he said, because the world we're building, it doesn't need your room, it needs new rooms. Rooms built with glass walls, not gated doors, with open microphones, not closed briefings. Then he paused and looked directly at Vance again. Maybe, Senator, the real question is no longer whether I belong here. A long breath. Maybe it's whether you do. The weight of that question hovered in the air like a final bell at the end of a debate. Not one person reached for their water. Not one camera blinked away because the man they tried to corner had just redrawn the battlefield. The echo of Traoré's final question still lingered in the hall, heavier than any declaration. Maybe it's whether you do. It wasn't just a rhetorical reversal. It was a statement of power. Not the kind that's flaunted, but the kind that settles in people's bones and forces them to reevaluate everything they thought was true. JD Vance shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The man who had mocked Traoré minutes earlier now looked like a senator caught off script in front of the wrong audience. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but nothing came. His political instincts, sharp on cable news, ruthless on the Senate floor, were of no use here. Because this wasn't politics. This was history correcting itself in real time. Traoré, still standing, allowed the silence to stretch just long enough. It wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, the way a general surveys a battlefield after taking the high ground.
"I did not come here to impress you," he said, scanning the table.
"And I certainly didn't come to be approved by you. I came because my people are watching. Young men in Wahigya who plant rice with their bare hands. Women in boil lasso who walk miles for clean water. Children in refugee camps who still somehow find ways to laugh." His voice softened, but the firmness never left it. They don't care about summit badges or who shakes hands with who. They care about whether they'll eat tomorrow, whether they'll live to see adulthood, whether their leaders will defend them or sell them for another IMF loan. A soft murmur of agreement rippled through a few delegates. These weren't African cliches. These were live truths delivered by a man who didn't need speechwriters to understand pain. Vance finally tried to reclaim ground. "Mr. President," he said, voice measured, "I don't dispute your passion, but if you think isolation from international institutions is the path forward, you're only sentencing your country to further hardship." Traoré turned toward him, not aggressive, but surgical. "And if you think dependence is development, Senator, then maybe the hardship isn't mine. Maybe it's your definition of progress." He let that linger. "For 60 years we've been told to reform, to modernize, to comply. And where has it gotten us? Buried in interest payments, stripped of our resources, and blamed for the poverty your systems created." He stepped back from the table, slowly closing the folder he had opened at the start of the confrontation. "We are not asking for charity. We are demanding fairness. We're not walking away from the world. We're walking toward it, but on our terms." Now it was no longer just a counterattack. It was a manifesto. Traoré's last words had drawn a subtle but unmistakable line. A declaration that Burkina Faso, and by implication much of the global South, was no longer seeking inclusion. It was seeking transformation. Senator Vance looked around the room, searching for a nod of validation, a sympathetic glance. None came. The usual diplomatic choreography, eye contact, subtle smiles, performative agreement had dissolved. The room no longer orbited him. It now revolved around the man he tried to diminish. Traoré let the silence linger once more, then continued, not louder, but clearer. "I understand why men like you find leaders like me dangerous. We don't play. By the old rules, we don't wait politely for our turn. We don't smile while we're being robbed." He took a slow breath, then added, "And we don't forget." There was no shouting, no finger pointing, just the unmistakable clarity of someone who had buried friends, faced real war, and survived not because he played the game, but because he refused to. "You called me emotional," he said, turning again to Vance. "But what's more emotional than invading countries for oil, than justifying coups for contracts, than punishing entire populations because they choose a path outside your geopolitical playbook?" A soft cough echoed near the back of the hall. It felt out of place, like someone had forgotten where they were. "You say I don't belong in this room, but let me tell you what I think this room is, okay? A place where power has been confused for wisdom, where age has been mistaken for virtue, and where influence has replaced integrity." He raised his head slightly. "And if that makes me a threat to this room, then so be it." This wasn't just a statement anymore. It was an act of reclamation. You built a system that rewards silence, Senator. A system that keeps Africa on its knees, begging for grants with one hand, while handing over its resources with the other.
Hey.
"I didn't come here to beg. I came to warn." Murmurs this again, this time louder, more restless. The kind of energy that fills. Doesn't ask permission to rise. It simply rises. That was when the moderator, who had barely spoken since the exchange began, leaned into the mic. His voice was soft but reverent. "President Traoré, I believe the floor is still yours if you wish." To continue, Traoré looked at the panel, at the cameras, at the globe watching live. He nodded once. "I will continue," he said, "but not for this room." He raised his voice now, not in volume, but in intention. I will continue for the rooms that never had microphones, for the fields where no summits are held, for the mothers whose children were buried under decisions made in rooms like this. By now, Traoré's voice wasn't just cutting through the room. It was cutting through decades of diplomatic hypocrisy. Cameras captured not just a speech, but a rupture. It's not just a clash between two leaders, but a dismantling of an old world order. One sentence at a time. I didn't travel here to be tolerated, he said. I came because the world deserves to know that Africa is not your project. It is not your cautionary tale. It is not your experiment in controlled progress. He paced slowly behind his chair, no longer addressing JD Vance directly, because this was no longer personal. This had become generational. You ask us to accept the rules of global trade while the West dictates prices we can't control. You ask us to honor debt created by regimes you helped install. You ask us to play fair in a rigged game and then blame us for not winning. No. Moved. Not even the diplomats who disagreed, because even they knew this wasn't demagoguery. This was a mirror, and they didn't like what they saw in it. Traoré pointed to the summit logo on the wall, a glossy emblem reading cooperation for a new century. You put words like cooperation on banners. But we know what cooperation is meant for us. Extraction, interference, interrogation. We don't want another seat at your table. A pause. We want the table rebuilt. The phrase struck like thunder. It was instantly clipped, quoted, translated, posted. Within seconds, #rebuild the table was trending across African Twitter, then into European media feeds, then across the globe. I will not let my people be reduced to statistics in your economic forecasts. Traoré said, we are not forecasts. We are the force. He stopped moving. He faced the audience again. A sea of suits, earpieces, and stony faces. I understand that these words will make some of you uncomfortable. That's good. Comfort has preserved too many lies. It's time discomfort made way for truth. Even Vance had stopped fidgeting now. His earlier fire had turned into something else. Not agreement, but unmistakable reckoning. Traoré pointed to the glass doors at the rear of the conference hall. Out there are thousands of young Africans watching this summit, not to be entertained, but to see if the world still thinks they're invisible. Let me be clear. They are not. He leaned into the mic one last time. Neither am I. The moderator didn't try to regain control. The room was no longer his to manage. It belonged to the man they tried to minimize and who had just against all. Odds maximized the moment into a movement. Traoré returned to his seat, but he hadn't sat down. He had landed. The kind of landing that comes after flight. After turbulence, after a storm that shifts not just the room, but the climate itself. A hush lingered for almost a full minute after he stopped speaking. And in that space, something rare happened. No one wanted to follow him. The German chancellor looked at his notes and slowly closed the folder. The French foreign minister whispered to an aide who subtly shook her head. Even the IMF director, known for his long-winded opening remarks, leaned back in silence. And JD Vance. He stared at the nameplate in front of him, the one that only hours ago had felt like a badge of seniority. Now it looked more like a label on a closed door. The moderator finally cleared his throat. Thank you, President Traoré, he said, voice cautious but sincere. Your words will no doubt shape the rest of this dialogue. But everyone knew Traoré hadn't just shaped the dialogue. He had redefined the terms. Reporters in the back scrambled to update headlines in real time. Burkina Faso, President, electrifies summit. Young leader silences critics in Brussels showdown. JD Vance's challenge crumbles under Traoré calm fire. Traoré didn't gloat. He didn't grin. Simply leaned back and took a sip of water, the same glass. He'd calmly sipped from earlier, before being told he didn't belong in the room. Now, no one dared suggest otherwise. The delegate from Brazil finally raised a hand. I'd like to echo the president of Burkina Faso's points, perhaps before. We proceed with policy recommendations. We should reflect on the room itself and who it's built for. That opened the floodgates. South Africa backed him. So did Indonesia, then Chile, then Kenya, then Serbia. Within 10 minutes, the conversation had completely realigned. No longer about economic models or aid targets, but about agency, about who writes the narrative, about who has the microphone, and who decides when it's passed. Vance eventually did speak again briefly. His voice lacked the punch it once carried. "I believe we still need structure," he said. "But perhaps that structure must evolve." It was the closest thing to a concession a man like him could offer. Later that evening, as the summit concluded its final session, Ibrahim Traoré walked through the marble hallway outside the main hall. Cameras followed. Delegates reached out. Young journalists asked questions that didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded hopeful. One asked, "Mr. President, how does it feel to change the conversation?" He paused mid-stride, then said quietly, "It's not about changing the conversation. It's about reminding the world that we've always had something worth saying. They just weren't listening." And then he walked on, not as a guest in someone else's room, but as the architect of a new one. The following morning, the headlines weren't just about policy. They were about a shift, a tone, a face, a name. Ibrahim Traoré. It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a flashpoint. Political scientists called it the Brussels reversal. Activists in Nairobi dubbed it the room reclaimed. Commentators across Europe reluctantly admitted it. The youngest man in the room had just delivered the most seasoned message. JD Vance returned to Washington under a shadow. Fox News tried to spin the moment. America challenges African radicalism, but the clip told a different story. The silence after his insult, the response that followed, the way the room leaned away from him and toward Tor, it was unspinable. In Africa, the impact was seismic. University students in Ghana organized spontaneous debates titled, "Who Belongs in the Room?" Nigerian youth parroted Vance's comments in skits that went viral. In Ouagadougou, billboards showed a photo of Traoré standing at the summit with 5 simple words beneath: "We never needed permission." At the presidential palace in Burkina Faso, Traoré met with his advisors in the early dawn. The air was cool, his voice measured. "This isn't about me," he said. "It never was. This is about what happens when we stop asking to be heard and start speaking with the belief that we already matter." Maurice Sankara, now his national security advisor, nodded. "They'll come harder next time with different weapons. Economic, digital, psychological." "I know," Traoré replied. "But now we've seen what happens when we don't flinch." Later that week, a letter arrived at the palace. It wasn't official, no seal, no embassy stamp, just a handwritten message from a group of African diaspora students. Studying in Boston. "Thank you, Mr. President, for not whispering, for not waiting, for proving that dignity doesn't need translation." The paper was folded neatly. Traoré kept it in his jacket for days afterward. Across Africa, something began to move. Subtle at first. Not a revolution, something deeper, remembering of who they were before borders were redrawn, before loans replaced land, before power was measured in proximity to Paris or DC, and at the center of that remembering stood a man who was told he didn't belong. A man who walked into their room, turned it upside down, and walked out without raising his voice. Because sometimes the loudest thing a leader can do is simply refuse to be small. They told him he didn't belong. That his age, his accent, his country were reasons to sit down, not stand up. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't come to be included. He came to be undeniable. In a room built to silence voices like his, he spoke, not with fury, not with fear, but with a calm, relentless truth that shook marble walls and decades-old assumptions. JD Vance wanted to make an example of him. He did, just not the one he planned. Because what happened in Brussels wasn't just a moment, it was a message. Africa doesn't need permission, it needs the mic. And now that it has it, the world better be ready to listen. This wasn't diplomacy. This was dignity. And dignity, once awakened, does not go back to sleep.